everyone, and welcome to our European Council on Foreign Relations webinar on Europe's next geoeconomics game plan. My name is Agathe Demarais, and I'm the head of the Geoeconomics Initiative at ECFR, and I am delighted to be joined today by Sabine Weyand, the Director General for Trade at the EU Commission, and Tobias Gehrke, a Senior Policy Fellow at ECFR. A few things about housekeeping before I say a few words about what we do on geoeconomics at ECFR, and then we turn to the discussion. The first thing is that this event is public and on the record. The second thing is that it will be posted on our YouTube channel later today. And the final thing is there will be a Q&A at the end of the event, so please do feel free to already send questions using the chat box of the Zoom software. Before we delve into the topic of geoeconomics today, a few words about how we at ECFR work on geoeconomics. But I thought first that it may be useful to give a definition of geoeconomics, because this is a word that we often see and we often hear about, but sometimes there's a lack of clarity about what geoeconomics really is. So the perspective that we have about this topic at ECFR is that there are two definitions of geoeconomics. There's a broad one and there's a narrow one. In the broad sense, geoeconomics is about the interplay between geopolitics and economics. For instance, in trade, see US-China tensions, trade war, about technology, for instance, about export controls on semiconductors, or about finance. For instance, in the field, we can have a think about Chinese new financial mechanisms to vaccinate China against sanctions. So that's the broad sense, the interplay between geopolitics and economics. And then there's the narrow sense, and it's about applying economic tools, such as sanctions, for instance, to pursue foreign policy goals, such as curbing Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine. Geoeconomics has long been a key topic at ECFR, and we've been doing a lot of work lately to take our research to a higher level. We have a geoeconomics initiative, which is up and running, with more staff, more research outputs, and many more exciting things coming. And the reason we're here today is because we have just published a package of geoeconomics publications, one calling for the appointment of a geoeconomics VP in the next EU Commission, and another one that was published by Tobias, authored by Tobias, which explains how the EU can step up its geoeconomics game. And this is exactly what we're going to discuss today. And of course, spoiler, we at ECFR think that the EU should have a much bolder, ambitious approach to geoeconomics. So I could talk about these topics for hours, but I'm going to turn to you, Tobias. Now, you've recently published last week a brilliant policy brief titled Fortune Favours the Bold, upgrading the EU's geoeconomic strategy. Do you want to tell us more about the background for a publication and your main policy proposals? Because we at ECFR love policy proposal, concrete, actionable, and that we can implement.
Yeah, thank you, Agathe, and good morning, everyone. Exactly. So we wrote a report, and the basic idea was we take stock of Europe's economic security, de-risking agenda, and how they support Europe's economic outlook. For some credit, we really think that these strategic agendas have begun to relink security and economic policy, a link that has been dormant for a while. And that's really a success story. But we also identified a couple of challenges that we think the new EU mandate could address. First challenge is that while these strategies recognize that there are very difficult trade-offs between security, growth, climate, they haven't really managed to get a good methodologies to political leaders how we navigate these trade-offs. So more to be done here. The second challenge is that the economic security strategy has good guidelines, how we try to manage risk, promote, protect, partner. I think many of you have heard this trifecta. But in practice, we find that we struggle to really link these three elements, promote, protect, partner, together into a coherent strategy. The third challenge we found is that other powers, China, Russia, the United States, have, of course, their own geoeconomic agendas. And these agendas are partly dictating also our options, our de-risking options, for example. I think we recognize this very much, but the strategy struggles to really account for this dynamic in our way of operating. So bringing these sort of geopolitical dynamics into the strategy much more is one of the elements. So in sum, we think the outlook is changing very well, but we think it remains a bit too narrow. It's too reactive and perhaps so far also a bit too defensive. So we think the next mandate, the next EU mandate, must not only think about tools. Agathe, you mentioned what are the tools, but we also have to think, I think there's more to be done in fine-tuning the strategy. And that's what we try to do in this brief. We suggest 3 ways to do that. 3 Ps, in fact. So you all know the 3 Ps of the economic security strategy. We suggest 3 more Ps. So bear with us, it's going to be 6, but we say 3 ways: making it more proactive, the strategy, making it more political or geopolitical, and resetting some of the principles. I'll very briefly go through these 3 guidelines that we suggest. A more proactive strategy, we think, needs to go beyond risk mitigation. The main focus so far is risk mitigation. I think we need to move beyond that. I think everyone here agrees interdependence is not going anywhere in key economic sectors. So de-risking alone, we think, is not sufficient. It will not succeed across the board. And so we need to, while we do de-risking, have a second leg of our strategy that basically does the opposite. Instead of only focusing on our vulnerabilities, focusing really on our strength and the potential leverage that that strength gives us. Sounds very intuitive, but it does require a bit of a mindset shift, because strength is not simply the size of the single market or the overall competitiveness of our entire economy. I believe strength comes from really key positions in supply chains and where our industry is located there, what kind of positions they command in these supply chains. Because these kind of positions, they are really allowing states to shape supply chains in a way that other powers are doing. And so we have to, I think, focus on these elements much more in our strategic thinking. The second element we introduce is to say we think we need to be more political or geopolitical, less siloed in our structure. Strategy, the objective of strategy, we think, needs to go beyond risk mitigation. I already said that. Trying to define goals that we need to achieve. Geopolitical goals, for example, I think, are preventing a widening Chinese support to Russia's war, building a more war-resilient economy against Russia's threat. These are geopolitical goals. These goals can, I believe, provide a structure under which then we can organize our economic instrument. Just like the Green Deal is a political goal that has helped us in the last years to really restructure some of our economic policies for that goal. Now, I'm aware defining European EU common geopolitical goals is a bit of a big ambition, and there's no shortcuts to this. But one step to that path lies in governance, we think. So there are more low-hanging fruits of how the Commission, the member states, and the private sector communicate on geoeconomics, what kind of information they share and collect. So there are some fruits to become more geopolitical just by way of governance. Finally, third one, and then I'll stop. Principles. We think a reassessment of some of the trade principles that govern the most critical supply chains is necessary. So geoeconomics is not causing deglobalization. It's also not causing decoupling at large. But there is a form of reglobalization, which means certain strategic supply chains are most certainly rewired. And this rewiring of some of the supply chains is often done through standards, new standards. Which products can be produced where? Who can trade with whom, right? There's a standards game that the powers are using. And in this kind of game, we see the EU at risk of being a standard taker. The goal, we think, should be to be much more active in this standard game, meaning we should develop with our allies and our partners new kind of economic security standards which determine participation in the most critical supply chains. Determine participation on factors other than costs. Because if only cost is the main factor, whether you'll be in or out of a supply chain, we will have very limited way of shaping supply chains. And I think the goal needs to be to be part of the shaping of the most critical supply chains. The EU has been quite active on standards, particularly on sustainability and climate, right? Where we have standards that also reshape supply chains. We think that we need to become also more active and invest in these kind of standard building in the more security realm. What does resilience mean? What is a trusted partner? These kind of questions. So these are the 3 Ps that we believe can help the EU upgrade its geoeconomic game. We do have a bit more specific policy suggestion, but I'll come back to that perhaps later. Thank you.
And everything is in Tobias's policy brief, which I should really say is a wonderful read. So I highly recommend it, and I've posted a link to it in the chat box of the Zoom software. So Tobias, listening to you, it's all about moving from a defensive posture to a more promoting posture. There's the question of standards, of principles, of governance. Sabine, I'm going to turn to you now to hear your take about our ECFR proposals, what you think should be the priorities for the next EU Commission on all things geoeconomics.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks for organizing this, and thanks for having me on this webinar. You have sung the praise of Tobias' paper, but let me also refer to the commentary that you, Agathe, have posted yourself on this, because I think we need to look at the 2 issues together. Now, this is obviously the perfect moment to make this sort of recommendations to the incoming commission, while we are all working on what to recommend to the incoming commissioners. It's, of course, also a risky moment for me to pronounce myself on the priorities of the next college. The next college is not there yet. I mean, at least we know who's going to head it. So that is already progress, but still we need to wait for the next group of commissioners to come in. And we need to look at the attribution of competences, etc. But with that caveat, I'm very happy to answer to your questions here and contribute to the discussion. Now, the first point is, I will limit my introductory remarks to 3 points in reaction to what you have set out. The first point is about trade-offs. You are talking about them in your papers, but you're not really acknowledging what it means. That would be my concern a little bit. When a new development comes around, like the focus on geoeconomics, we all tend to focus on what's new and what changes, and we tend to forget the elements that are elements of continuity. But there are quite a lot of those as well. So your papers could be read as implying that we are in a world totally dominated by economic security or geoeconomics. And I would argue that that is not the case. Yes, we are witnessing a paradigm shift from efficiency to resilience. We are witnessing a consequential shift from a rules-based economic order to a power-based one. But the emergence of the resilience or geoeconomic paradigm doesn't mean that considerations of efficiency are going away, not at all. And I think this is something we really need to be careful about, because we need to trade off competitiveness and security. And it is not the same, and security cannot dominate everything. Because if we look at the entirety of international economic relations through a security prism, that risks leading to a loss of efficiency, which reduces our competitiveness and makes us weaker to assert ourselves in what is a geoeconomic game. And here, if we only focus on security, we really make ourselves more vulnerable to security threats. So we need to look at both competitiveness and security. And here I would like to refer to Anthea Roberts' risk-reward resilience framework, which exactly points out the need for this balance that we have to strike here. So let's not forget about competitiveness. Now, the second point I wanted to make is about something which is not really touched upon at all. And Tobias mentioned it and said, talked about states shaping supply chains. I think we need a reflection about the role of public authorities and private actors. because it is still private actors and companies that shape the supply chains. They do so within rules developed by public actors, but the idea that public authorities can micromanage supply chains, I think, is a mistake. It will not work, it cannot work. So we need to have a much more thorough reflection about that. In this context, I also wanted to comment on Tobias's point about the standard setting. I really think that the EU is still leading the standard setting also in the tech field. Whether that is GDPR, which has set a gold standard for privacy regulations worldwide, whether this is about the digital trade rules that we are now developing with third countries, whether that is about AI regulation. So I really don't think that we can be seen as a standard taker in these areas. What we have rather seen is the risk of overreach in standard setting. That doesn't apply so much to the tech standards, but it certainly applies to the sustainability standards, where we are at risk of alienating the very partners we need in order to tackle the challenges we face, whether they are the economic security challenge or the green transition challenge. So from that point of view, I see the risk rather in a slightly different manner. Now, everyone is very good at the alliteration game. And I see that you added your three own P's, but you forgot about two other P's that we have in our strategy, which is that the policy needs to be precise and proportionate. From that point of view, you call the focus on risks a reactive one. But as I said, if we treat everything as a risk, rather than looking at the opportunities, we risk overdoing the security bit and cutting ourselves off. So I'm very much attached to policy responses being proportionate to the risks that we identify and precise in the way they act. That distinguishes us from other players. But I am not resigned, and I hope the EU will not resign to basically being squeezed out by China and the US. We do have the ambition, and I also think we do have the means to assert our own course of action in this geopolitical world. And if I may add another definition of my own to your different definitions of geoeconomics, I like to talk about economic statecraft. And that is about the coherent deployment of economic tools to further our objectives. And that brings me to the last point I wanted to make in this first round, and that is about what are the priorities then of the next Commission. And I think the priorities here are to look at something you've also been talking about. We need to look at a better coherence between internal and external policy. And that means that when we regulate for the internal market, we need to keep in mind what this means for our global competitiveness. That is a point which is eloquently made in the Letta report, and which I think is something we really need to take to heart, which means that we have to go about regulating for the internal market in perhaps a different manner than we've done so far, i.e. taking much more into account the repercussions of our regulation globally. Then, of course, we have to continue doing more coherence between our different external policies. You said that our strength and our leverage is not just about the single market, the size of the single market. I agree with that, but it is about the strength of the internal market. That is what gives us leverage. And that means that in relations to third countries, we need to deploy in a coordinated manner all the things that they are interested in, our third countries, our partners are interested in, and to put on offer something that is attractive for them. And that means trade instruments, but it also means research and development cooperation. It means financing tools for investments. It means a whole lot of cooperation in other areas, from energy to raw materials, etc. And that is something the next Commission needs to look at, where we say, okay, take a given country. What are they interested in? What do they need at this stage of their development? what can we offer, what do we want from that country, and that then we put together a whole approach. Global Gateway is beginning to make inroads into that, but it hasn't advanced enough. And the third element of coherence, and you're talking about that in your paper as well, is the coherence between what we are doing at EU level and at member state level. And that is obviously the most difficult. Now, this is not about who implements sanctions. By the way, you know, EU policies are always implemented by member states. You know, we don't have enforcement authorities at EU. We rely on the member states doing that. So that is not a novelty in the field of economic security. That is just the way the EU works. But obviously, economic security is closely linked to national security, and that is where member states are very protective, sometimes too protective, of their formal competencies, not taking into account the economic reality, which basically obliges us to work together in a more integrated manner between what has been happening at member state level and what we need to do at EU level. And that brings me to my last point. You put a lot of faith in one person, which is this vice president for geoeconomics. Now, I think we need much more than that. If you look at the three areas where we have to improve coherence in the next mandate, you will see that that requires an overhaul of how we do business inside the Commission, and not just one person who would be very hard challenged to realize all these objectives and all the faith you put into him. So a vice president for geoeconomics is certainly not a panacea. What we need is a different structure, which allows us, and here I come back to my first point, at each and every moment to take decisions on the basis of evidence, facts, and figures, and decisions where the response is proportionate and targeted to the problem we are trying to address. And that is a constant trade-off. And it is never fixed. So from that point of view, the ambition or the coherence of the overall strategy will come from a million individual decisions that will have to be taken, taking into account the whole environment we are looking at, and all our various instruments and interests. So I think I leave it at that as a first comment, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Evidence-based, data-driven policy. I like that. That's music to my ears. I have tons of follow-up questions. Before I ask the first follow-up question, I wanted to mention there is a Q&A function in the chat box of the Zoom software. We'll have the Q&A in about 10 to 15 minutes. So please do feel free to already type in any question you may have in the Zoom box for a Q&A. So my first question, and it will be for you both, perhaps Tobias, you can also respond to some of the points that Sabine made in her remarks with this question. What do you think is Europe's leverage in this era of great power competition? What are Europe's strengths? What is our leverage to continue to count on the global scene? Perhaps, Tobias, if you want to go first, and you can answer some of the points from Sabine, and then Sabine, you go next.
Yeah. Thank you. There was so much in it. I'll have to come back to a few of them, the ones where we hopefully agree, Sabine, not the ones with contention. But I'll try first your question, Agathe. So I think leverage and strength, I think what's foundational to this question is to really understand the critical supply chains and the ecosystems and how they are connected. Understanding them inside out is foundational. So I don't have a ready-made answer of this is exactly our strength. So I think building the infrastructure with governments and the private sector, how we understand where assets like advanced manufacturing capabilities, like research and innovation centers, specialized equipment makers, raw material suppliers, how they connect in an ecosystem and how they interlink, plus how other states are trying to shape these assets and these supply chains and how trying to rewire them. That's a sort of a knowledge base that we need to build. And I do think that the list of critical technologies that the European Commission released last year, for example, plus the risk assessments that the European Commission, the member states are carrying out, it's a really good first step and the right direction. Well, I think that needs to be much more institutionalized, a more serious structure where we are not doing a one-off risk assessment, but where the Commission and the member states commit much more resources to understanding these supply chains on a continued basis. So we make some suggestions on that in our paper. And that means perhaps bringing also in experts from industry, but also from the security world to understand what kind of information is really relevant, what is intelligence relevant, because understanding these ecosystems goes much beyond mapping the trade system. It's also, as I mentioned, how are states trying to use certain parts of this technology, for example. And so that, yeah, perhaps not the best answer, but I do think building this kind of infrastructure that other states are doing at rapid pace, the United States, but also Japan, for example, are building this. And so I think we have to, the next mandate has a chance to now go a step further of what they've done. Perhaps allow me just one more minute on two more aspects that Sabine mentioned. I'll focus on the ones that I think we're very much in agreement with. On the governance question, on top of the Commission side, that's what we say the EU Council and the European Council have a lot to do. So we suggest that at the ministers from the different trade ministers, competitiveness, foreign affairs, and so on, come together at least twice annually for a geoeconomics council, just like we have a jumbo council for defense and foreign affairs. I think that's something what we need to do, but also at the working level, there's so many working groups in the council who cover certain of these issues. We think a role by the Secretariat and the European Council could help with exercises, common exercises where different council working groups come together to pitch into the same issue, could help, because the buy-in from the council is key on all of this, as Sabine mentioned, and so that's another one. And the final one is perhaps with the private sector. Buy-in is key from the private sector, a private sector that is vigilant, that subscribes to the risks that policymakers set out. Having a sort of high-level meeting between private and public sector that work on a common report of really identifying what the issues are in this interface between the public and the private. A high-level report, a high-level meeting that works on that, we think is key, because there are conversations with the private sector, of course, but bringing that together at the European level perhaps could help in that. That's on the governance side, and on the matter of how do we work with our allies internationally. I also fully agree with what Sabine mentioned. We have to have a great offer, a package of offer together that goes beyond the trade market access offer. And I think we have to be a bit more precise also. I think what the EU is doing in raw materials is a great example. We've become very specific of a risk that we're trying to address, the kind of partners we have to work with to address that risk, the kind of offer we have to make to those partners. I think it's a great exercise that we could perhaps build on in the next mandate. So rather than just raw materials, which is at the very top of value chains, can we not build also very specific alliances or partnerships along downstream the value chain? For example, a battery alliance, where you don't just work with the battery raw material players, but also with countries like Brazil, Japan, Korea, who have stakes in battery equipment and other elements of that value chain, for example. So these are some of the ideas of how we could think of what we're doing quite well in raw materials. I think expand that to other parts.
Thanks a lot, Tobias. Sabine, a lot to answer, I suspect. You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, there's a time lapse between me pressing the button and my computer reacting. Now, indeed, I think there's a lot to react to here. Now, let me come back to this point that really that is really an issue of concern for me, and that is the link between public authorities and the private sector. Now, Tobias has talked a lot about a more structural approach to critical supply chains, what are the foundational technologies, etc. What we see, however, is that what we need is a framework that allows us to be as dynamic as the economic and industrial developments we have to react to. So we have the tendency to focus on the supply chains of today and trying to understand those. What we underestimate is the dynamism of people saying, well, very nice to have a more diversified access to lithium, but lithium is today's technology. The battery technology of the future goes in different directions. The public sector doesn't have that knowledge, and if we are trying to be too prescriptive, too detailed, we risk running behind technological and industrial developments. So what we need to find is a way where we are plugged into these developments and where the state acts as an enabler for technological developments we cannot foresee. So what we need is a Standortpolitik for Europe. So where we basically develop Europe as an attractive place for research, development, doing business, but where we let 1,000 flowers bloom, because we cannot know what will be the advanced material of the future. We may focus on fine-tuning, diversifying, optimizing supply chains on materials of today, but we underestimate the dynamism of the technological development. And I think we are at risk of forgetting the lessons from the pandemic. The state tried, or public authorities tried, to organize supply chains for personal protective equipment, for vaccines, etc. We were constantly running after the developments in the private sector. And I think what we should see is we should trust the ability of companies to adjust. Not every company, but if you leave enough space, if you act as an enabler, you will have companies who will find the way forward. And we cannot pick the winners as public authorities. We do not have that insight. No actor has that insight. Private sectors don't have that insight either. But if you have 1 million of them experimenting, somebody will come up with a solution. So I think the way we need to organize this is that we leave space for these developments. And that is something which is very hard to do. I'm worried that we invest all our capital into understanding supply chains of today, while missing the fact that the material of the future, the raw material that is required, the technology of the future is elsewhere. So I think that is the challenge, where we really need to look at the state as an enabler and the single market as an enabler by being a competitive and contestable market. That is what we need to focus on, because we have a big internal market. And here, as I said, I do believe the strength of the EU is the internal market. And trade is what connects the internal market with the rest of the world. So if we focus on making the single market innovative, contestable, have competition there, that is the prerequisite for European companies to be competitive worldwide. And that is an investment both in our prosperity, but also in our resilience and in our ability to withstand the pressure of others. I also somehow detected in your paper sort of an assumption of effectiveness of the US policy and of Chinese policies. I think the jury is out there. I think we see the cost to the American economy of their China policy. What we do not see yet is whether it will succeed in the objectives that they have. I think from that point of view, I think we should approach this next phase of globalization with confidence, because we have a lot of assets. I think our more targeted approach and more proportionate approach, our risk-based approach to economic security is, in my view, a very good way to go about that.
Thanks so much, Sabine. We have about 8 minutes left, and I really want to keep some time for a Q&A. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to the Q&A now, because I was looking at the chat box and we have 12 very good questions, so we won't be able to answer all of them. But actually there is one question, actually a few questions related to the same topic of sustainability and standards and not alienating partners. So I thought I would ask you this question, Sabine. It's all about your remark about the fact that the EU risks alienating some partners with some standards. What's your take on this? What should the EU do? We can think of the deforestation-free law, for instance. What's your take about the way forward and the priorities on that front and the trade-offs? Because I know that you've been talking a lot about trade-offs today.
Now, the first thing is, of course, that we stand by the objectives of these pieces of legislation. Yeah. Now, we have, however, regulated without taking the necessary time to talk to external partners in advance, to explain to them what we are trying to do, and to listen to them about how best to do that in a way that they can actually comply with these rules. So now we are doing that while preparing the implementation. We have created the time to do that for CBAM. And I think on CBAM, we see that you can manage this. We have created space. We had the 3-year transition period to prepare the implementation of CBAM. And we see that companies from third countries are engaging now in trying to see how can we do that. And we have the possibility to adjust the details of the implementation in the light of what we hear from partners. So that is work that is ongoing. Now, on the deforestation regulation, we have less time. So there is a squeeze here because this is to enter into force by the end of the year. But we are now colleagues in DG Environment, but also colleagues from DG Trade. We are very much engaged with third country partners to see how to make this workable. Now, I'm not sure that we have found all the answers yet, but there is intense work going on. And I cannot preach. I saw a question in the chat. So what will happen under the next commission? Well, I can't say that. But what I see is that there's a lot of work to be done in order to implement this regulation in a way that fulfills the objective, but that is manageable for third country partners. So we have to be very careful. We have partners in Africa where we have invested a lot on cocoa, and now they tell us we can't comply with the way you want us to do this now. So we have to help them. Yeah, we have countries in Central America who say, be careful, because if we can't access your market for the products we are so far exporting to you, people will turn to cocaine. Yeah, and so I think we have to be very careful about this. And we are fixing this now, trying to fix this now during the implementation. But I think for the future, it means that when we legislate, we have to do thorough impact assessments, which also look at the external dimension. Yeah? Because nothing is won if partners turn away from our market and they continue unsustainable practices and just rely on other markets as an outlet. That would be a lose-lose scenario we are trying to avoid. And as I said, that's why this is not something that can be fixed by a VP in the future for geoeconomics or whatever, but that is something that we need to fix in the way we work in preparing legislation at the level of the services.
Thanks a lot. Tobias, I'm going to ask you a question about the tools. Essentially, it's Christmas. If you could pick one tool, one new tool, or one tool that you would like to upgrade that you think would be critical in the geoeconomics field for the EU to fulfill its ambitions, what would you say on that front?
I don't have a fancy name for it, but basically what perhaps Sabine described a little bit on the external front, I think, the kind of offers we can make to partners and how we link different policy tools together, I think there's a lot more room for improvement. As Sabine mentioned, sort of bringing not only a trade opening to partners, but bringing a whole financial offer, allowing our financial tools to take direct stakes there, for example, in a different country, not just on the infrastructure level, but really helping them commercialize some of the industries that our partners want to be part of. That's really key. And I think that's a bit of a challenge. We are with in certain supply chains, I think it's very hard for partners to be part of. Think of the battery value chain, where the battery equipment is so dominated by certain players. If a Brazilian company wants to be part of that supply chain, I think it's very hard. You either get Chinese investment, or you, I think, have a very hard time of tapping into this industry. But many partners want to tap into these supply chains. So I think our task has to be to really, really help them get there. And standards is one way where we say we have a set of standards, not only sustainability, not only deforestation, but a set of standards for what kind of battery equipment, for example, we would like to have in our industry. That is not just price. That, I think, can be a positive narrative, I believe, to some of the emerging economies that helps them get into these supply chains and compete basically with China on factors other than price. And so I think there's some room here, and on working with the kind of offer we make to our partners, I think we have done a lot more with the raw materials, as I said, but we can do more.
Thanks so much. I see that we have 4 minutes left, so I will have one final question for you both, and it's the wild card question, of course, that is on many people's minds. Trump, a Trump 2.0 scenario. What do you think it would mean for Europe's geoeconomic ambitions? Would it be good news? Would it be bad news? Would it lead Europe to even strengthen further, or would it be really bad news? Perhaps Sabine first, then Tobias, and then we'll have to close the webinar.
I have to disappoint you on that one. I'm not going to speculate about the outcome of the US elections. That is in the hands of the US voters. What I can say, though, is that as EU, we need to be prepared for all scenarios. And that brings me back to the point. We cannot, we have the ambition and the ability to chart our own course in world affairs, whether it's politics or economics. And we need to equip ourselves to make that possible, whoever is in the White House or whatever the policy of other countries are. So I think we should approach this with confidence. We are, of course, looking at announcements from the different candidates of what their future policy will look like. That is something we are analyzing, because we will obviously have to be able to deal with that. But I refuse to have EU policy defined by others.
Tobias?
Yes, I'd say generally I agree that we have to, no matter who is in the White House, we have to do our homework. And I'll tell you one short anecdote. A senior European diplomat told us in conversation with a US counterpart on some of these economic security restrictions, export controls, contestation, what these measures should do for Europe. The American counterpart listened, and at the end of the conversation, the American counterpart said, "But you have no leverage." And I think that's a pretty good anecdote, because no matter who is in the White House, we need to do our homework to strengthen our strength or leverage. And that's kind of what we're trying to help with this report, and what we're going to continue working on in the next year. So maybe that's a good way to close it there. We need to think of our leverage, not just abstractly, but quite concretely.
That will be a perfect conclusion, Tobias, and definitely whatever the outcome of the US election will continue to push forward Europe's geoeconomics agenda. We are bang on time. So thank you so much, Sabine, for joining us today. Thank you so much, Tobias, for being with us too. I have posted links to your publication, Tobias, in the chat box. I felt that this was a really fascinating and lively exchange. So thank you so much to you both. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. The replay of the webinar will be posted on YouTube later today, and we look forward to having many of you in future events. Thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.